Hey, what's happening, everybody? Welcome to the Alternate Point of View. My name is Tracy Lee, and we are in my new office. And as you can see, I have a bigger space. I am no longer locked away in my cloffice. Yay! So I wanted to make my new debut, my video in this new space. And how exciting is this? This is a brighter space. I have now taken over my husband's room. He used to have a room where he could have whatever he wanted in here, and now it's mine. Woo! So anyhow, today, you guys, we are going to talk about Betty Broderick because, you know, it's all fair in love and war, and I have always been a weird, twisted Betty fan. And I know, it is a catch-22, right? It is how can you be against the Menendez brothers getting out of prison? Well, they were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And they should not even be up for parole. And here they are, right? Here they are. They got their sentence reduced to life. Well, actually, like 30 to life or some shenanigans. And they also got the opportunity to get parole, which is ridiculous. So here, Betty was sentenced to 32 years to life. And Betty has served well over her time. And she has been denied parole not once, but twice. And it just makes no sense. Betty is 77 years old. So if you don't know the story of Betty Broderick became famous also around the same time as the Menendez brothers, O.J. Simpson. Okay, this was clearly a time of vengeance. Okay, and Betty Broderick is a different kind. Okay, she's a different kind of vengeance. All right, so Betty Broderick did the same thing. Okay, she did something where she was very angry. She decided that she wasn't going to take it anymore. Okay, she was hell bent on revenge. Her husband, the man that she met, much like Kitty and Jose, who met in college, she got her education. She came from a well-to-do family. Dan also came from a well-to-do family. They were Catholic, I believe, very religious. When you get married, you have children. And that is what Betty did. And Dan was going to college to be a doctor, I believe. And Betty fully supported him, much like Kitty fully supported Jose. And she was also in the teaching career. But what happened was she had children. She had a lot of children, actually, and she was pregnant many times. She ended up actually losing a lot of her children with Dan. And it was a very hard time for them. She had children where they were so poor, even though they came from well-to-do families. She was supporting Dan's education. Dan decided he wanted to be, after going to medical school, Dan decided he wanted to be an attorney. So Dan was so smart that he was a doctor and a lawyer. And Betty, worked her tail off and raised kids to support Dan through this education. And he went to very good schools, and they were, fans of football, Notre Dame. They really lived as best they could. And even, she wanted him to be dressed the best. And Dan worked really, really hard to get the career and the money and the American dream. Okay. Meanwhile, Betty is working, teaching jobs. She's taking care of the kids. Dan is studying all night long and going to school all day long. And Betty is doing everything she can to be the perfect wife and mother. And all this time while Dan is working to get his degree, he's working to get into firms. What happens? It happens. Okay. Dan finally makes it big and he gets the job, the dream job. And they also move to California, much like Jose and Kitty, and he gets the dream job. So, you know, he gets that job in California and they get the dream. Okay. And what is Betty? She becomes the perfect wife, the socialite. She's raising the kids. She's doing all the things. She's the soccer mom. She's taking the kids to practice. She's keeping the house perfect. She's having dinner ready for Dan. She's looking wonderful. She's trying to keep her image and keep his image looking great. And what is Dan doing? What is Dan doing? You know, Dan is continuously moving up that ladder. He's becoming a partner at the firm. He's doing all the things that he should be doing because, you know, he did get the education. And Betty, who's the backbone of the family, she supported him every step of the way. But what's Dan doing? Dan is stepping out. Dan is stepping out and he's got himself a new woman who's basically a lookalike of Betty when Betty was younger, when Betty was in better shape, when Betty was all the things that Dan had when he was getting that degree and looking good. And you know what, Dan? Dan is aging gracefully. Just like most men, Dan's looking great. You know, Dan's staying in shape. Dan is doing all the things. And meanwhile, Betty's running herself ragged. She's trying, but she's got kids to take care of, a house to take care of, and she's just trying to keep Dan taken care of. But she can't because she's got to do all the things. She's done nothing but support Dan. Well, Dan is getting to schmooze and wooze with all the Richie folks. And meanwhile, he meets Linda, who doesn't know her butt from a hole in the ground. She doesn't know how to do anything, but Dan hires her as his assistant in this major firm. In this major firm, she goes from answering phones to suddenly she's his legal assistant. And she goes from being answering phones to a legal assistant to his live-in girlfriend. And unbeknownst to Betty, I mean, she and Dan were planning on buying a new house. They had plans. They were selling their house, fixing it up, making repairs, and Dan just moved Betty on out, moved Linda on in. And because Dan was so powerful and had so many connections and knew all the judges and had all the friends, and he was an attorney, and Betty was a housewife. She didn't have any connections. She had nothing. She was fully and entirely dependent upon Dan. All Betty had was her anger and her frustration. All Betty had was her words and her just built up, just what else could she do? So yeah, Betty left some mean, angry messages on the phone. Yeah, Betty went into her house and rubbed cake all over the wall and spray painted the walls, ugly names for the woman that he was cheating on her with. Yeah, Betty did some pretty vindictive stuff because Betty had no other options as far as Betty was concerned. So yeah, that's how Betty felt. It's not right. Not saying it's right, but you know, I'm just saying, you know, you push someone to those limits. And that's what happens. And I am not defending her actions, not defending it. Just saying, as I've said in many videos before, we all have it in us. Every single one of us do. It's just a matter of what is your button. What's the one that will push you to the edge? It could be over your kids. It could be over something like a man cheating on you. It could be over, I mean, you don't know. You don't know what it is. This was a combination for Betty of He was cheating on her right in front of all of their friends. He humiliated her and their kids. And he used their kids as leverage. And he basically kicked her out of their house and bought a Porsche and did this without her having any idea it was happening until it already happened. He threw her out for a younger version of her and acted like she should just roll with it. I mean, I know, like some people say, a lot of people say she should have just moved on with her life, taken whatever he gave her. But she gave up her entire youth. She lost babies for him. She looked at it as, oh my gosh, I sacrificed everything for this man to become successful just for him to share it and give it and hand it all over to someone else. And that's how she looked at it. That's literally how she saw things. So in 1989, Betty had had enough. On November 5th, after Dan married Linda, Betty was just at her wit's end. Dan was cutting Betty off. He was done paying Betty the alimony. She was getting a good sum of alimony, but Dan was tired of fighting back and forth with Betty. He was over it. She had a nice house, but he was still using the kids a lot against her. Betty was never going to stop. She wanted her life back, and she was never going to get it back. And once Dan and Linda married, Betty knew her life was never coming back to her, that Dan had finally closed the door. She was never going to get that back. She was never going to have her family back. She was never going to have the country club life back. She just wasn't going to have any of that back. And she was humiliated. All the friends that she and Dan had now were Linda and Dan's friends, and everyone welcomed Linda in with open arms because Linda was actually a nice person, but basically, again, Dan had replaced Betty with Linda. All the things that Dan and Linda did, the games, going to Notre Dame, he took Linda now. All her kids, the holidays, the house. I mean, they were living in the same house. I mean, everything was now Linda's. And Betty just could not accept that. And even the kids were like, Mom, just move on. We like Linda. I mean, it was devastating for Betty. And Betty had finally just had the straw that broke the camel's back. November 5th, 1989, she took her daughter's house key after her daughter had come to visit, and she used it to drive over to Dan and Linda's house and let herself in. And Betty also had done the same thing that the Menendez brothers did. She pre-purchased a weapon, and she walked in and surprised Dan and Linda while they were sleeping, and she started firing and didn't stop until it was empty. And the wild thing is, she could have, much like the Menendez brothers, she could have saved Dan because he was still alive. And he was reaching for the phone beside the bed. And she ripped the phone out of the wall. And she wrapped the cord around the phone and took it away and let Dan sit there and suffer and pass out until he was no longer alive. Linda, she died pretty quickly, but Linda was even able to, I believe, pop up. I'm not sure, but I know Dan was. And Dan was able to reach for the phone and made it to the floor. So it was pretty horrific. Betty would later turn herself in. She would claim that she just started firing, that she doesn't remember. It would be Betty's boyfriend at the time who would have found Dan and Linda. The wild thing is that Betty had, I won't say moved on with her life, but she did kind of sort of have, I mean, she had a boyfriend. She had a house. She did have access to see her kids, even though it was very, very contentious. It just wasn't something she was ever going to get over, ever, because they had to live in the same neighborhood. They had to see the same people. She couldn't see her friends anymore. They had all gone to Dan's side. It just felt like such a betrayal for her that she had lost everything. She'd lost the life as she knew. It was gone. She moved her entire life to California. She gave up her entire life for Dan to progress to become a doctor and a lawyer. She did everything. She lost babies for this man, just for him to find another woman, a younger version of her, and give all of that, all of the work she had done to someone else. And if there's anybody out there that says, you know, well, I can't relate to that, okay. I mean, I'm just saying, whatever. But I feel like Betty should be out of prison. She was not sentenced to life without parole, okay? She was sentenced to 32 years to life. She has served her time. She is not a danger to anyone else. Dan is who she wanted. The life with Dan is what she wanted. She eliminated her, I don't want to say it's a threat because Dan was not a threat. Dan was her goal, and that is gone. That is taken care of. I will say, as I've stated before, there was a time I did speak to Betty, and Betty is, and they say they have not paroled her because she won't show remorse. I think it's she's not going to show remorse. She's not going to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that he's not here and that Linda's not here." I think it's horrible. Linda fell in love with a married man, and that is wrong. You know, it's wrong to do what they did. It's wrong that Dan cheated on his wife. It's wrong that Linda knew he was a married man and she went for it anyway. It's all wrong. Okay. All of that is wrong. Dan is a snake. Okay. I don't care how you slice it. What she did was horrible. The fact that she took their lives is absolutely horrible. But she snapped. Like, she literally snapped. But at the end of the day, and I mean, I'm not going to get a lot of fans for this. Like, I'm not going to get a lot of kudos. I could tell no one's going to like me on this opinion. But Dan, dude, you cheated on your wife, man, and you made her life a living hell. After you flaunted it in her face, and Betty was not well. She wasn't going to handle it well, no matter how you did it, no matter what you did. You couldn't have brought it on to her easily. You couldn't have done it. You just couldn't have done it. You just couldn't. There's no way you could have done it. And I don't know how this would have made out. There's no way it would have made out where this was going to happen any other way. I just don't believe it would. Betty wasn't going to be one of those kind of people, any one of those kind of people that was going to be like, she's just that person that was like, if I can't have you, nobody will, because she invested every bit of herself into you so that you and your family could be successful, and you decided that you wanted something younger, better. I don't even know, whatever. You decided to be greedy and selfish, and what you had wasn't good enough. And that's where you messed up. And I don't know, but that whole reap what you sow saying, F around and find out, that's what you did. You effed around and found out. And Betty wasn't having it. And yes, Betty has served her time. And I don't think it's fair, but life's not fair, that the Menendez brothers, who literally did the exact same thing, and by the way, Betty was convicted of second degree. Like I said, she was sentenced to 32 years to life, not without the possibility of parole, which she was given 2 chances of, and she was denied both times. And these 2 sorry, horrific people who lied about what their parents did to them. And Betty, who's never lied, she's never lied. I mean, she's not lied. She did it. Yeah, I went in there. I did it. She did make up a few things. Granted, I don't know if Dan was abusive. I'm sure he was verbally demeaning to her in plenty of ways, but it seems like they had a pretty fairy tale relationship, other than the fact that, she did all the heavy lifting with the kids, with supporting him. Dan had a pretty easy life, considering he didn't have to do jack other than, get his education and provide like a man should do for his family. And Betty did all the other stuff. So I'm pretty sure, yeah, that's why she was pissed. That's why she was pissed. And then, Linda got to come in and do she got to come in and look pretty. So yeah, that's why it happened. That's what happened. So, we can all come in though after the fact and be, armchair quarterback like that, like we do. But that's how it's my point of view. That's how I see it. And I think she's 77 damn years old, and California is so lenient on everybody else. I don't understand why she is still sitting there in prison when the Menendez brothers have everybody and their brother on social media advocating for them to get out, when they did what they did to their parents and literally, hit their mom 10 times and their dad 6 times. And they have the whole world convinced that their parents did these horrible things to them, when I can say that, victims don't act like they do. Survivors don't act like they do. They're liars. And they say whatever they have to say to make themselves look good and get them more press and more popularity. Betty is she's a G, because she has not one time been like, I'm sorry, I feel bad. No, she's like, no, I did it. And I don't feel bad because that dude cheated on me. And yeah, he ruined my life. He took my life. And then he thought he could just throw me away like trash. She's like, and he's still effing with me right now. All of his friends, all of his mafia friends in the law business, still doing it now. So yeah, she don't care, because she knows how it went down. She's real. She's for real. So I'm just saying, y'all can say what you want, but if somebody did you dirty like that, you would want some kind of something. I'm not saying you go out and do that. I mean, that's pretty crazy. That's wild. But, maybe, she might be like, it was worth it. I don't know. Just saying. I'm just saying she should have as much publicity as the Menendez brothers. Maybe she don't need to be out. I mean, maybe she should be serving all this time, because, if it was worth it, it's worth it to her. But I'm just saying she should have as much publicity as the Menendez brothers are getting. They definitely shouldn't be out. So anyhow, but yeah, I just wanted to say, what about Betty? That's what I'm saying. What about Betty? I always say this. I talk about Betty because I think, what about Betty? I mean, Why doesn't she get her shot? So yeah,